Hi again, everyone. Patrick Fingston here. I write the Illinoize political newsletter, which you can find every day at theillinoize.com. Welcome back to our sorta, kinda, not so every weekly podcast. We've kind of taken a few weeks off as I've tried to adjust my life into a new radio gig. We started hosting mornings on WMAY down in Springfield, so it's been a busy summer. But we are back for the fall, trying to lead you into the fall election season. And on our show today, we're going to talk about transit. It's been a hot topic over the summer, especially because it might be the biggest legislative issue in 2025. The transportation agencies around the city of Chicago are facing a $730 million funding deficit in 2025 as federal funds have started to dry up. And it's leading to conversations in Springfield about what to do and how to keep transit running or rethink transit. And there are two markedly different approaches. We'll talk about one of those today with House Democrat Eva-Dina Delgado, who is co-chairing a new House Democrat working group that is set to try and find consensus among House Democrats on how to handle the transit fiscal cliff, as well as a potential reorganization of transit agencies around the city of Chicago. And we'll get her perspective on what she thinks and why Republicans weren't included in the conversations at all. The other focus has been from the Senate, where they've been holding field hearings throughout the summer. Senator Ram-Vili Vallam has been leading those, taking testimony mostly around the city and suburbs. But it appears that the Senate is not moving from a position that there will be no new funding without reform.
There will be no votes for funding unless we address service, governance, and the corresponding reforms that are needed to give our residents, the taxpayers in the RTA region, the confidence that this system, this public transit system, will be one that meets the once-in-a-generation opportunity to recreate a safe, reliable, accessible, equitable, environmentally conscious, and economically impactful public transit system.
So that's the Senate side. The House side is going to be a little more Democratic focused as we bring in Representative Eva-Dina Delgado. All right, and to talk transit, we are pleased to welcome Representative Eva-Dina Delgado, who represents the northwest side of Chicago. She has been named one of the co-chairs of this transit working group. Representative, welcome. Thanks for the time. Just how big of a deal do you categorize this transit cliff that we're coming up on?
Well, thank you, Patrick, for having me on today. Transit has been kind of a passion of mine for a very long time. And I've been thinking about the underfunding of the system before we started talking about this transit cliff. So I think it's a huge, huge deal. $730 million is what they're currently pegging the fiscal cliff at now. I frankly think that number might need to be updated. It might be larger. And if you were to cut that much money out of the Northeastern Illinois transit system, we're talking about 40% service cuts. And that essentially decimates the transit system. So yeah, it's a big deal.
Let me start here. It is a bipartisan, nonpartisan, fully across the spectrum of transit users. And even though I live on the other side of city limits, we still use Metro. We still use CTA when we're in town. Everyone seems to have lost faith in at least CTA, whether it's Dorval Carter Jr. or the leadership or the safety on trains or the unreliability of trains. Is it harder for CTA or RTA to come to you and say, help us, when there's so little public trust in what's happening out there today?
I would say, I'm going to go back to my previous comment about the system being underfunded for decades. And when I talk about the system, I like to talk about it in regional terms. I know a lot of folks have used all of the transit services, whether it was CTA, Metro, or PACE, right? I do think that riders are frustrated right now. And there's a lot of reasons why the service may not be what riders expect. I think COVID really did affect the way people think about transit, and that dip in ridership, I think, has led us to a lot of the challenges that we're seeing right now. So yes, I think the answer to your question is, can we get revenue without reform? And I think the answer is no. We need reform to be coupled with revenue and other changes that we want to see to the services. I mean, that's part of the reason why I've been talking about the bill that I introduced, that Ram Villavalam and I introduced. That is a pretty significant change to the way transit functions. But I think that we need to start the conversation somewhere. And that's what we're trying to do.
I think the next big question then is where, and we can talk about what the unit of government should look like, but I think we can touch on that. But I think we need to talk more just in terms of sheer cash. I mean, we're talking the number that they've tossed around is $730 million in shortfall for starting next year, essentially, when that federal cash runs out. You guys aren't just sitting on that kind of pile of money in the comptroller's office. I mean, it's not just it just doesn't show up, on trees. So I guess the real starter here is, no matter what we do, where do we find the money?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why this working group is going to be important. And I think the Senate is also going through their own process. We are looking at the system holistically. We want to talk about what kind of changes do we want to see, what kind of accountability is going to be expected of the agencies. And, all of that feeds into a conversation of, what is the right amount of money that we need to invest in the system. So it's a complicated web of different pieces. And we're starting that official process now. And I will also mention, so we've been talking about, I think anticipating this fiscal cliff probably for the past, probably since mid-COVID, right? So definitely the last 3 years, if not more. And Ram and I put together a resolution that called on CMAP to do a review of the entirety of the system in Northeastern Illinois, and with kind of this charge of have some bold ideas. If you were to do this over again, how would you do it? If you were to recreate Northeastern Illinois Transit, what would it look like, right? And so they did come back to us with a number of suggestions, 3 in fact, and that bill that we introduced is actually option 1. So there's been a lot of thought put into what are some of the options. There's been a lot of data-driven processes here, and we're just continuing that partially with this working group, and I think overall the legislative process.
It would have to result in a tax increase, though, right? For somebody?
I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I think we still have to work through this process. It is going to be a long and collaborative process. We need to have lots of different people come to the table with different ideas. I mean, when I think about the CMAP process, they created a board of folks, like a steering committee, and it drew from, all of the stakeholders you can imagine. We had disability rights folks, with labor, you had business, you had, other rider organizations, you had government organizations. I mean, all of us have to come together to figure out what the right solution is.
What about, I've heard concerns from specifically CTA advocates, whether it's those who are running CTA or those who wanted to be specifically city focused, that moving everybody under one umbrella, the idea of CTA, Metro, or PACE all under one roof, would dilute the city's impact on its own transit. We don't want the suburbs having a say in L lines, essentially. Is that sort of thinking going to make this even harder to find some sort of solution?
So I like to try to reposition the discussion. I like to think about transit in Northeastern Illinois as regional. And for a very, very long time, there's been this battle between city and suburbs. But the reality is, if you center the rider in this conversation, so the person who is using the system, they don't know or necessarily care what the governance structure is. They want their bus to be there on time. They want their train to be there on time. They want it to be predictable. They want it to be clean. They want it to be safe, right? These are baseline things that I think writers right now just don't feel like they're getting. And so I don't think that we can just say we're going to leave everything exactly the same and people are going to be happier. There has to be some sort of adjustment.
Transit's not a Chicago or suburbs only issue. There are popular bus services downstate. Champaign-Urbana Metropolitan or Mass Transit District, I think, is a one that's a great example of being such an important asset to the community, especially with the U of I down there. There's no representation on this working group south of I-80. Is that missing the point that this is a statewide issue?
So I can tell you from my perspective. So Speaker Welch has created this working group process, and from what he's told us and from my understanding, the idea behind this is to allow the Democratic caucus to come together and to have collaborative conversations and maybe to develop consensus. We've got a large caucus and it's very diverse. So lots of people and lots of ideas. And sometimes it takes a smaller group of folks to come together to try to drive those conversations. The issue, as it was raised to all of us, including myself, it was really a Northeastern Illinois issue. Now, that does not mean that once we start really talking about legislative solutions, that we're going to ignore what's happening downstate, because transit downstate is incredibly important as well, particularly to the riders who depend on it. So I think that there's always an opportunity for any of those members to come and sit down and have a conversation with other members. My door is always open. And every member in the General Assembly knows very well that Eva-Dina Delgado is a transit nerd and loves to talk about this stuff. So we're in the very early stages of how we develop a final solution. Everybody's got a way to come into the conversation. And I think we're just going to keep that door open.
Why not include any Republican voices? Why not make this a bipartisan working group? There are plenty of suburban Republicans. There are some that are pretty good on this sort of thing, like Brad Stevens, I think, is a pretty smart guy when it comes to regional issues. And I get that this is a caucus issue, but it's going to take so much more than just one caucus to get this done. Why not widen the scope and make a consensus bill happen? Because wouldn't you rather have 118 votes on something than 78 votes?
I mean, I'll tell you, this is going to most definitely have to be a bipartisan solution. I mean, that's what I believe. And I'll just reiterate again, the working group process is something that Speaker Welch has created to help within the Democratic caucus, have more collaboration and consensus building and trying to bring us as a caucus together. Now, the reality is the working group process is not the legislative process, right? The legislative process is going to continue to be what it should be, which is also a collaborative and engaging process where everybody has a chance to have a voice. Like I said a minute ago, my door is always open. As a matter of fact, a couple of days ago, I sat down and had a very productive conversation about transit with two of my colleagues from across the aisle, one in the Senate, one in the House. And I expect that those conversations are going to continue. I would love the solution to this to be bipartisan, because transit is bipartisan. This doesn't cut across party lines. People use the system and they come from all walks of life, right? So I would love to have a solution at the end of this process that is bipartisan.
But let me be the sour apple in the barrel here. I mean, do you guys really care about anything being bipartisan? You have super majorities in the House and Senate. You've got a governor who can do whatever he wants, essentially at the top of government. Do you really care what Republicans or anyone who's not a Democrat thinks?
If you're asking me personally, I do. I care deeply about what is happening for all of the members of the General Assembly, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on. I like to consider myself a pretty reasonable consensus builder when it comes to legislative issues, and particularly this one. This is going to be a complex and difficult solution to come to. So the more folks that we have involved and engaged, the better it is. I mean, you mentioned Representative Stevens. Our borders are not that far apart. We come very close to meeting. And so a lot of his constituents are users of the system. A lot of my constituents are users of the system. I would love for him to participate, and frankly, he is participating in the conversation. So yeah, I do. I care. I think that's how a legislator can be successful in this process. I think it makes a difference to have bipartisan support.
But then there's the challenge in your own caucus, right? I mean, you guys like to call it the Great 78. But you probably would have enjoyed the moment at the end of May when I'm standing on the rail with a couple of other reporters and I'm just racking my brain trying to figure out what's holding up the budget process, what's holding up the tax increases that you all ended up moving, which was another story all on its own at 4:30 in the morning. And I think everybody's general consensus was, all right, this is going to be the progressives that are holding things up, that they want more spending, they want more taxes, they don't feel like they're getting enough. And then by the end of that crazy overnight session, we find out it was the moderates who were really putting a check on things, saying we don't want extra taxes, we don't want to spend too much, we don't want this and that. Those are two widely different views inside your own caucus. How do you guys manage this, especially when we're talking about trying to fill $700-800 million or more of a hole?
Well, and I think that the working group process, that's why it exists, and it's been pretty successful in my opinion. When we've used this working group process on a couple of different big and complex issues. We had a working group for public safety. We had a working group for reproductive rights. We've had a working group for gun safety, right? So, it is a way to try to bring as many people into the conversation as possible. And I can say, on this transit working group in particular, I think we've got a really good cross-section of members that represent the entire region, right? So it's not skewed one way or the other. We have a lot of folks who represent people in all the different areas so that we can have a robust conversation about it. There is no doubt that 78 Democrats is a lot of Democrats. And we all have very distinct and strong opinions about things. But I think that's how you end up with the best results in terms of policy making.
Representative, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you one campaign question, not necessarily related to you, because your district, Joe Biden won by, let me check, 63 points in 2020. So you're not what they would call a swing district. But there is certainly, between all the money that House Democrats have, the benefit of the gerrymander that was passed in 2021. There are 7 districts Republicans represent that President Biden won in 2020. All indications show that the Democrats are poised to expand their majority. They're already supermajority, already record high 78 members in 2024. How big is too big? Because we've already seen that you guys are having a hard time getting things like the budget across the board or across the finish line. Is this to a point where the public just looks at this and says this is too much, and maybe there's pushback in the end?
Well, I like to look at it this way. You know, if there are people, voters in particular, out in the communities who align with democratic values, then I'm a supporter of that. I love that. And so if that means that we end up with a larger majority than we have, then I'm not going to complain. I think legislating overall is going to it's a challenging thing to do, but I think it might have been Nancy Pelosi who said in an interview not long ago that the art of legislating is the most it's the most fun, it's the most fulfilling, it is what I think what I love the most about the job, right? And so if that means that I have to spend a little bit more time working with fellow Democrats who might have different opinions than I do, then I'm willing to do that.
I worked a congressional race a few years ago where John Boehner came and spoke and talked about being speaker is trying to keep 218 frogs in a wheelbarrow. So that might be Chris Welch's challenge in the next General Assembly. Representative Eva-Dina Delgado, thank you so much for the time and appreciate it. And hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. It's been fun.
Obviously, we haven't heard the last about transit, and it's something that we'll keep an eye on, and it will certainly be a hot topic as we get into the 2025 legislative session as well. I want to turn the page now to corruption and those issues facing the state of Illinois, continuing to face the state of Illinois. We are happy to bring in our friend Ray Long from the Chicago Tribune, talk about a series they're running in the Tribune detailing Illinois' long history of corruption, as well as the ongoing corruption trial of former AT&T executive Paul Schiazza, and next month's scheduled criminal trial of former House Speaker Michael Madigan. From transit to corruption. That's the word of the day in Illinois, I think. Or corruption isn't the word of the day if you're Mike Madigan's attorneys, but we'll get to that. We're pleased to be joined by Ray Long, great political reporter from the Chicago Tribune. Ray, I wanted to first talk about this great series you and Rick and your other colleagues at the Trib have been doing on corruption and the history of corruption in Illinois. We talked about it on the radio a week or two ago, but wanted to kind of hit on it here really quick on the podcast that it is such a sobering reminder of some of the really weird, bad people that have come through state and city government, isn't it?
Well, I think it's the power of the detail in this series that we're doing that really has an impact, or at least it will open the eyes of Illinoisans. We have documented all the way back to the beginning of time in Illinois for European settlers when they moved in to Chicago, when they formed the state in 1818 and formed the city in 1837. And we even came across documents from the Chicago Common Council. That was the one before the city council was formed. And they had records there that are still available in the archives that are held at Northeastern Illinois University that showed they had political problems with the vote count and rigged election allegations in 1844, 7 years after Chicago was incorporated. And that was in a mayor's race. And they ended up invalidating the mayor's race and having a do-over. So it goes way back. And then we move up, of course, through most recently in our series, we've been talking about City Hall and the City Council. And in the last 50 years, we've had nearly 40 aldermen who have gone to the pokey. And that's for a variety of corruption, but it a lot of times is stemming from bribes or zoning cases or things that are basic theft.
Don't get the Trump campaign going on rigged elections. You could get it. But I think, and it's both a state and I think city of Chicago obviously is part of this too, because they're all under the same campaign finance rules as most state candidates. Federal is different. But the state campaign finance rules are a joke, right? That the money is unchecked from legislative leaders. You can break the caps at any point with a
Right.
essentially a 1-day loan from your local bank if you don't have
Yeah.
$100,000 cash. It and yet and all of this money just flows in from lobbyists, from businesses, from big donors, from JB Pritzker, et cetera. Ken Griffin before he hopped on his G6 after, or as Richard Irvin was getting whooped 2 years ago. But is there ever going to be a serious conversation? Because the finance reform after Rod Blagojevich was insignificant in the scheme of things.
Right.
Is there ever going to be a serious conversation about campaign finance reform in this state?
Well, we don't know. We don't know if pointing it out will make a difference, or whether somebody will pick up the ball and say, hey, here's the holes that the Trib has pointed out. Here's the holes that reformers have pointed out. Here are holes that we think could be improved. We don't know if the powers that be will care or do anything. The track record is not great when you point out things through a scandal. A lot of times there's a band-aid approach put on whatever the scandal was, and then there'll be loopholes put into the law so that folks can take advantage of it. One of the more recent ones also deals with lobbyists too, where there was great fanfare that Illinois finally put a revolving door clause into the law. And of course, you know, Patrick, a revolving door clause says basically that a lawmaker can't walk out of his elected position and then go right into a lobbying job. Well, some states have as much as a 6-year waiting period. Illinois put in a 6-month period, but if you are leaving in the last 6 months of your term, you only have to wait till the end of that term, and then you can start. And if you wait for the full length of your term, on one day you end your term of public service, and the next day you can start as a lobbyist. So
essentially, if you're a lame duck and you didn't run in November, you lost in
right.
November, and your term is up on January 10th when the new legislature is sworn in, you can resign on January 9th and become a lobbyist on January 10th.
Right. You can complete your term, and then when the clock starts the next day, you can become a lobbyist. And so that is not a real hard line like the ones that other states have. And it's made that way because a lot of people don't want to cut their options, and they're the ones making the rules and passing the laws, and they don't want to limit to their possibility of making more money. It goes into the overall issue with a lot of these things, which is greed.
Well, and that's the thing. When someone's winning, right? It's either the Bruce Browner almost billionaire funding Republicans along with business, or it's JB Pritzker, the billionaire, and unions funding Democrats. So whoever's in charge doesn't want to limit their own power, their own fundraising capability.
Right. In fact, they're making laws to increase their power. They're tilting the laws to help increase their power, rather than look at it through an altruistic lens and say, hey, this is the way your mama would like it to be done, so that you can do things straight up, right?
A couple of corruption trials I wanted to touch on with you, Ray. The case of former AT&T executive Paul Schiazza is ongoing as we record this Thursday morning. This plays into the whole Madigan situation.
Right.
It's sort of like ComEd, but a little bit smaller. Explain what it is and what it means for Madigan.
Yeah, the basic thing is this is a little bit of a preview or a curtain raiser, if you will, for a small piece of the Madigan trial, which is coming up October 8th. That's a big racketeering trial, as you know. And the issue here in the Schiazza trial is that he was the head of AT&T Illinois, and Mike McLean, who's a co-defendant in the Madigan trial and has been convicted in the ComEd 4 trial, was a lobbyist, and he was a go-between with Madigan, a longtime confidant and pal. And Mike McLean reached out to AT&T and said, we'd like for you to put Eddie Acevedo, a former lawmaker, on your payroll. Now, they didn't want to list him as a lobbyist because there have been complaints over the years that he was a little recalcitrant, had a drinking problem, etc. And he wasn't popular with Republicans. He's a Democratic lawmaker.
That's an understatement, by the way. Republicans hated this guy. Hated this guy.
Well, he was on the Democratic leadership team under Madigan, and so they instead of making him an actual lobbyist, what they did was they put him on a contract of a lobbyist. So a lobbyist named Tom Cullen, who had been a staffer and a great political mind in the Madigan operation, was lobbying for AT&T, and he put Acevedo on a contract with his lobbying group. So it didn't go down as a lobbyist who got registered or anything like that. It was an attempt to give the money to Acevedo, who didn't do very much of anything for that money. So the question is whether all this was done in a way to try to trade with Madigan, so that Madigan would go along with legislation that AT&T wanted. And the legislation did pass. It was an elimination of the requirement that you have to have landlines for everybody available. And there were some pretty dicey emails here that Schiazza wrote and said that he wanted to make sure the powers that be knew this was going on, and replies were something like, yeah, they'll know, etc. And so the question is whether all of that is crossing the line into the bribery-related breaking of the laws. And so that is why it's a little bit of a preview of the Madigan trial too. You know, as you mentioned, AT&T did pay a fine. AT&T already admitted to wrongdoing, paid a fine of $23 million. They're kind of they paid the fine, but they acknowledged rather than admitted too much wrongdoing.
And Ray, before we let you go, the Madigan trial is scheduled to start about a month from now. He and his lawyers are working overtime to try to limit the scope of the evidence. They
Right.
want the word corruption banned from the trial.
Right.
I mean, they're throwing everything but the kitchen sink at this.
Yeah.
How successful have they been thus far? And
Well,
over your shoulder, we can see that you literally wrote the book on Madigan. So, so what are they doing so far?
They're definitely trying to throw everything they've got at it. Madigan has put up $8 million from his campaign fund, so he's trying to leverage every angle, and he's trying to win the game before the game is played on the courtroom floor. And he is saying
sounds familiar.
Yeah, right. And it's very similar to his pattern in winning the game and trying to knock people off the ballot when he was had Republicans running against his Democrats and trying to shape legislation the way he wanted it before he'd bring it up for a vote. So he has definitely tried everything, attacking the press coverage, saying it's unfair to him. You know, it's one of those deals where I guess a guy who was the longest serving Speaker of the House in American history didn't expect anybody to be writing about this massive trial that's coming up where he's accused of racketeering and bribery-related counts. So this is going to be the thriller in Manila. They've got a great law defense team for Madigan and McLean. They've got a great set of assistant prosecutors who are handling it for the feds. So this is going to be one of those that's going to examine not only how Mike Madigan handled his business, but how Springfield handles business overall.
The trial of the century, right?
Ray there Long, we go.
Ray Long from the Chicago Tribune. Ray, thanks so much for the time. As always, we appreciate it.
Good to be here, Patrick. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to Ray Long from the Chicago Tribune for his time. We certainly always appreciate him taking time to chat with us, whether it's for the newsletter, for the podcast like this, or on the radio. So we certainly appreciate Ray and all the work that he does. Also, thanks to Representative Eva-Dina Delgado, who is a co-chair of the House Transportation Democrat Working Group. And we'll see what they plan to work on through the fall and into the spring. She told me she'd give us an update come veto session time. So hopefully subscribers will get a window into that negotiation when we get into the fall. And thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the issues facing our state. And we'll keep bringing it to you every week or almost every week here on the Illinoize podcast. Have a great day, everyone.